I hate Morpheus. That's right, I said it out loud. Hi, I'm Dr. Raghu Athre. I'm a double board certified facial plastic surgeon based here in Houston, Texas. Maybe hate is a little strong word, but I'm not a big fan of Morpheus and some of the energy devices that are used to non-invasively tighten the face. It's not that I'm jealous, I'm going to tell you why. So in order to understand why I think these energy devices just aren't good ideas if you're considering facial rejuvenation, let me kind of first start explaining how the face works, how does aging work, and you'll kind of see that it makes logical sense to why these energy devices just aren't effective in rejuvenating the face. And it's not that they're just not effective, they actually do a few bad things. So, first of all, as we look at the face itself, the face is made up of layers. So the first layer that we see on the top is the epidermis. Okay, that's the most superficial layer of skin that we see. Underneath that, we have the dermis. Okay, the dermis and the epidermis are kind of glued together. They create a skin layer. Underneath that epidermal layer is a very thin layer of fat that cushions the face. When I talk about the face, most of all of this is also analogous to the neck. Some of the names are a little different, however, that same idea still hangs out. So underneath, we have dermis, epidermis, we have thin layer of fat, then we have our muscle layer. This muscle layer in the face is called a SMAS, S-M-A-S. It stands for the superficial musculo-aponeurotic system. That layer is contiguous in the neck with the platysma. Underneath that layer is a bunch of stuff. I call that the deep structures of the face and the neck. So in the face, we've got a lot of muscles like the zygomaticus muscle, all of those kinds of things. The buccal fat, which there's a lot of talk about, that's underneath that layer. And so is a very important structure in here called the facial nerve. The facial nerve is important for all the motions that you can see me do right now with my face. In the neck, you still have the same skin, thin layer of fat, muscle layer. The muscle layer in the neck is called the platysma, and underneath that you have the deep neck structures. Those deep neck structures include muscles, such as the muscles for the tongue, some of the muscles that adjust the position of the voice box, as well as your submandibular glands, and some of the nerve branches from the facial nerve dip down into the neck as well. So that's a basic understanding of the anatomy of the face. Let's take that and go to the next level. How are these tissues actually affixed or stuck to the structures underneath? So the hard structure we have underneath is the actual skull or the cranium. So the facial tissues are stuck to the underlying layer with certain ligaments. Those are called the osteocutaneous retaining ligaments. Okay, long word, let's just call them the facial ligaments. So those ligaments are basically what takes all of this tissue and glues it down to the bony structures underneath. Now you have several of those osteocutaneous retaining ligaments. There's a big one right here called the zygomatic ligament. Okay, there's some cervical retaining ligaments. There's an osteomandibular cutaneous ligament right here. And there's a masseter retaining ligament in these areas. So these ligaments basically affix to the underside of the SMAS layer, and they allow these tissues to basically be affixed to the hard, bony skull. That's the foundation. As we age, there are multiple things that occur. I've said in many of my videos that one of the things that happens is that we lose collagen and elastin. So collagen and elastin and all of these structural proteins are kind of like building blocks. And these building blocks are the same building blocks that also make up some of these tendons and all of these ligaments and structures. So as gravity starts pulling down, number one, two, we lose some of the volume of our face and our skull. And three, we lose the actual integrity of those retaining ligaments. This starts to fall. As it starts to fall, you can see that the face is still tethered in those areas. As it is tethered in those areas, we see the aging, and it's very clear because the aging is completely related to where those tissues are stuck or glued to the underlying bone. For example, this section of tissue right here is really glued very hardly down to the mandible bone right here. So as the rest of these tissues fall down, you get a little groove right here. And we call that the marionette line or the pre-jowl sulcus. So you see this piece of tissue as it has fallen, but this part is still stuck here, and you see the line and you see the fullness right here. Very similarly, this tissue is kind of stuck to this point right here. So as this fat pad starts to come down, it's held up by the end of that little ligament, and we see all of the volume loss in this area. So this is one of the very common areas that we see hollowing, and most of that is because of the fact that this has prevented those tissues and it has gone down to a certain point. So this is the basis of facial aging. So thus far, we've kind of covered what the general anatomy of the face is, the layers of the face, and these osteocutaneous retaining ligaments that are basically holding these tissues down to the underlying structure. So now let's really go into how we rejuvenate the face. So as we think about rejuvenation of the face, we've also kind of just hit on this idea that aging is kind of predictable. And it's predictable because once you understand that anatomy, you're seeing aging in very classical patterns based on the fact that tissues are falling, they're stuck at certain points. So as you're lifting these tissues back to where they're supposed to be, we have to separate those retaining ligaments. And the reason for that is those retaining ligaments prevent motion of the tissue. Just like the retaining ligaments have prevented that tissue from just falling all the way down, they also prevent you from pulling up. So therefore, if you really want to rejuvenate the face, you've got to divide those retaining ligaments so that you can move the muscle layer as you need to achieve an appropriate lift. So now you kind of see the physics of what we're trying to do when we're rejuvenating the face. Now let's take a little sidebar and talk about non-invasive treatments. 99% of the non-invasive treatments are energy-based, okay? So they're using different types of energy in order to rejuvenate the face. This could be radio frequency energy, can be ultrasound energy. These are different types of energy that are being used to non-invasively rejuvenate the face. Let's take Morpheus, for example, because it's one of the biggest trends and fads right now, especially over social media. So Morpheus uses a combination of radio frequency as well as microneedling. So in order to understand what this does, we've got to be able to kind of divide this up and see what each of these treatments does individually. Microneedling, I'm a huge fan of. What microneedling involves is putting small tiny needles in the skin and causing controlled damage within the layers of the epidermis and dermis. So you can think about microneedling very similar to aerating a lawn. So if you've got a lawn, you're making little tiny holes in the lawn so that fertilizer and all these different things can actually hit the roots of the lawn, making and giving you a stronger lawn. Similarly, microneedling makes little channels so that you can put stuff on top and it can actually sink into the skin, helping the skin evolve. It's not tightening the face, merely improving the skin and the quality of the skin. The microneedling also does something else. By doing a controlled injury, it's increasing some of the collagen and elastin within the skin itself. The whole effect of microneedling is to improve the quality of the skin, not to actually lift the skin. Now let's take a look at the second part of Morpheus, which is the radio frequency. What the radio frequency portion of Morpheus does is apply energy to heat the tissues underneath. As those tissues are being heated, those tissues remodel. Think about a steak in the microwave. As you put a cold steak in the microwave and you microwave it, the actual steak changes form. It gets hot. As it gets hot, the tissues of the steak actually change. This is what you're trying to do with Morpheus. The goal is to try and heat the tissues up to a point where you can actually cause change in the tissue and cause tightening. Now let's take this idea and break it down and me tell you why it doesn't really work. So the depth of penetration, I'd say how far the Morpheus actually goes down within the skin, is about 4 millimeters. What that actually is the level probably through the epidermis, through the dermis, and into that fat layer that separates the deep dermal junction and the SMAS layer. That's about where you're applying this energy. That energy really tends to melt some of that fat and cause a little bit of scarring in that layer. Now, the energy does not go down deep enough to really affect either one, the muscle layer, which is the actual plane that we lift in a facelift, or two, the ligamentous structures, which are even deeper, that are preventing the face from moving up and down. So the depth of penetration of Morpheus is nowhere close to where you actually need to have some sort of action to truly lift the face and get reliable long-term results. So this is a very quick explanation that showing that the Morpheus really is not able to do that. But what's the downside? You could say, hey doc, what's the downside? Let me just try it, and even if I get a couple of millimeters of lift, I manage to get some lift without having to do anything. Here is where the big problem lies. When we do surgery, for example, facelift surgery, the first plane that I'm dissecting is between the skin and the muscle layer. Then I dissect deep to the muscle layer and divide those ligaments. Now, in a person who has had Morpheus, first of all, there's going to be scarring within the layer between the skin and the muscle layer because that fat layer got melted. It got melted, it got heated up, and therefore there's some scarring in that area. So as I'm dissecting that area, first of all, I have noticed surgically, it's a much harder dissection. Number two, the dissection is much more bloody because of the fact that there's some scarring in that area. To add fuel to the fire, the problem happens is that scarring sometimes even thins out the muscle layer. So as I'm dissecting below the muscle layer, the actual tissue that I'm using to pull the facial tissues and neck tissues now has decreased structural integrity. So on all counts, it's not achieving what we want it to achieve, and it's giving you a lot of negative results. The final thing that I have noticed, and this has been an experience thing as my career has gradually developed, is that fat layer above the muscle layer is extremely important. As we age, we all tend to lose some volume. If you take a look at someone who's young, a young person who's in their maybe early 20s or late teenage years, and take a look at their grandmother or great-grandmother, you can see that the tissues are much thinner. The skin in the face and the skin in the neck has lost a lot of its oomph, its thickness, its integrity. So what has actually happened in this is not only does the collagen and elastin within the layers of the skin slowly dissolve, they're losing some of that fat layer between the skin and the muscle layer. So if you've had Morpheus, first of all, that process is accelerated because that fat has already been melted. So as you do a facelift, you seem to see a very skeletonized skin, especially in the neck. I feel that youth is volume. Volume equals youth. So therefore, what happens is I like to preserve as much of that thin layer of fat as possible so that when you redrape the neck and you're redraping the face, the face and neck look young, youthful, and plump instead of skeletonized. So this is a few of the reasons why I feel that Morpheus and many of the other energy-based devices are really not effective alternatives to surgery. Not only do they not produce the desired result, they actually give you some bad stuff, i.e. melting the fat, melting that tissue layer, increasing scar tissue between the skin and the muscle layer, and making dissection difficult. So as you walk through this idea of facial rejuvenation, I would really urge you to consider some of the things that I've said in this video. We all would love to have something for very low downtime, very cheap, with no incisions. However, when that option actually is impeding your overall facial rejuvenation, I don't think it's a good option. I think there's definitely more options that you should consider and really think about as you walk through this journey. So, is it impossible to do a facelift after Morpheus? No, it's just harder. And some of the results may need to be negotiated on just due to the existing anatomy that Morpheus has created. So if you have any questions about this video, my thoughts, my opinions, please don't hesitate to send me an email, drop a comment down in the comment section below, or even ask a question. If you like this content and want more of it, please hit the subscribe button. You'll be alerted to when new content comes up on our channel. Till then, I'm Dr. Raghu Athre, double board certified facial plastic surgeon, Houston, Texas, inventor of the 4D lift. Thank you again.